Welcome to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. All right, audience, raise your hand if you're busy, want to save money, and like things that taste good. That describes a lot of us, and those are some of the most common reasons that many of us rely on processed foods. However, these foods can have a major impact on us in some ways that are obvious, in other ways that are maybe not so obvious. Accordingly, the title for our session today is Unwrapping the Truth About Processed Foods, Impact on Your Health, and How to Overcome Temptation. To help us work through this, we have Kate Zeratsky, who's a registered dietitian and nutritionist at Mayo Clinic. Kate, welcome to the Human Optimization Project.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Camp.
And not only is Kate a clinical dietitian and nutritionist, she's also the specialty editor for Nutrition and Healthy Eating Guide for mayoclinic.org. It's a fantastic website. I recommend you all check it out. She's also active in nutrition-related curriculum and course development, focusing on the areas of wellness nutrition and education related to weight management and practical applications of nutrition-related lifestyle changes. Kate has been in clinical practice helping patients and athletes of all ages and ability levels at Mayo Clinic for 25 years. Kate, to get us started today, I want to outline our three big questions that we have to kind of organize the discussion. So the first big question we have for you, what exactly are processed foods and why do they matter so much to our overall health? The second question, why do so many of us rely on processed foods despite the known downsides? And then lastly, we'll get into some solutions. And our third question is, what are the practical steps we should take right now to minimize processed foods in our diet? Does that lineup sound okay to you?
That sounds great.
All right. Well, we'll start with the first one. And I think starting with definitions is always helpful to kind of set the stage. So can you start by defining what the term processed food really means?
Sure. So when we think of a processed food, really it's a food that has been altered from its original state, say the state that Mother Nature gave it to us in. And I think if we try to relate that to our food and our food supply, we quickly recognize like, wow, that could be a lot of things and it can look different for a lot of different foods. So very simply, it could be something that, the shell taken off of a nut, where we think about some other things that we eat that have different colors and shapes and textures that would we would never find in nature. So there is this continuum of kind of what can happen in processing. And there was a group out of Brazil that actually has made an attempt to classify processed foods. And within that, they have four categories. The first category being unprocessed or minimally processed foods, and it goes all the way up to what they call ultra processed foods as category four. And so in between, as you can imagine, things are maybe a combination or less processed than, say, category four.
Okay. So let's talk about some of those ultra processed and highly processed foods. What exactly is happening in that process? What defines the definition? What is happening to those foods? And specifically, I'd like to know what's being removed and kind of what's being added and what are the implications of that?
Right, and I think that's where our concerns kind of start to come in and why we're talking about this is and to your point, I think a lot of times we think about what's added and we get nervous about those words that are really long and that we can't pronounce. But to your point, it's just as much what is not there, what's been taken away. What did Mother Nature put in there? And then through the processing, it was removed. So that's just it. We're missing out on nutrients. We're missing the fiber. We're missing the vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants, and probably compounds that are in that food originally that we haven't even discovered how good it is for our body just yet. And they're removed. And then to allow them to be shelf stable and safe. And I think this is, when we think back to why do we even have processed foods? Processing food is really it originated to make food safe to allow food to travel from its origin to us in our region of the world and allow us to consume it safely. And so it was maybe heat treated, had salt or sugar added to control bacterial or mold growth. So it's gone from its origins and safety to where we're at now with, wow, that's a really interesting shape, texture, color, and oh, it feels, different in my mouth or, whatever. I like that feeling or I like that crunch or that flavor and taste. And so it's really evolved in terms of what processing has done for our food supply.
And the most common things that you see added to foods now are would it be sugar, chemicals, preservatives, salts?
Yeah, so that's just it. So you think about originally it might have been salt and sugar, but now we have so many different types of salts and sugars. And that's really those long words a lot of times that we're seeing on the back of the package. It's a lot of times it's a salty ingredient, a sugary ingredient. But now there's also things that are added to enhance taste or to enhance texture, to make it not crumble and fall apart, or maybe something to hold it together. And additionally, there are things that just make it more appealing. They add different colors. And because we know when we're presented with more interesting food choices and colors, as consumers, we eat more. So it's that appeal to us, that shape and color and crunch or smoothness. Those are all things that we attribute to, I like this food for this reason. Or we might not even think about that consciously, but that's what's happening.
And how common is this in our world today? Is this a pretty universal problem? Does this tend to be just an American problem? How prevalent?
We think about the American food supply and the westernized diet and it's not, but it's unfortunate, it's not just us. Even in countries in Asian countries, they're seeing the influx of processed foods, and I think the statistics I saw were maybe up to 20% of their food supply. And in European countries, Australia, they're seeing a higher influx, maybe 40-50% of their food supply. Here in the US, the number is about anywhere between 40 or 70, depending on kind of the data you look at. I was looking at it, kind of thinking of it in a different way, just as a visualization. If you walk into a grocery store, really the only unprocessed foods are the apples and oranges and things that are out on display. Pretty much everything has been touched or modified. Hence our advice of, try to stick to that outer ring of the grocery store. You're still going to get some processed foods, but hopefully it's not as processed if step down some of the aisles. Not all aisles are bad, but yeah, some of the aisles.
And I like how you set that
Mhm.
up and that foods kind of exist on a spectrum and that
Yeah.
a lot of foods have some level of processing. Somebody is picking it, washing it, shelling it, like doing something that sort of counts. But it's probably those highly processed foods and ultra processed foods that we need to be on the lookout for. So I want to give the audience some tips on what to look for to know if they're looking at something that is highly processed or ultra processed. I guess one of the obvious ways is if it's coming in a box or a plastic wrapper or a package, that's probably one
Mhm.
indication. But I'm sure there are more sophisticated ways in terms of the nutrition facts, ingredients. What do we need to look at?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, if you look at the nutrition facts, that's an that's the indicator of what's in it nutritionally. So you can look at things like even just starting at the calories. If it's a higher calorie food, and again by that's a little bit arbitrary, but snack foods, if you're around that 150, 200 or higher mark, if you're looking at a meal, 500 calories or more. But really start by just looking at the calories and then make your way down the list. If you're making your way down that list, look at what the saturated fat is, because oftentimes, again, saturated fats in the form of tropical oils have are more shelf stable. In our country, in the United States, they had to take out the trans fats out of foods. And so when they did that, they replaced them with tropical oils and they're saturated. So we do have a concern about that in our heart health. And then if we keep going down that list, looking at, is there fiber? Is there any vitamins or minerals within that? And then as you keep going down the package, there'll be a list of ingredients. And again, as you're looking at those ingredients, what kind of ingredients are you seeing? Are you seeing whole food ingredients? That's what we're looking for. We're looking for it to say the list of, if it's, a meal, we want to see a list of a protein rich food. Like we want to see chicken, or we want to see beans, or we want to see tomatoes or green beans or the vegetables that are in it. And then I think if we keep going down, knowing that the ingredient list is in weighted order. So what's in it most is going to be at the top by weight, and what's in it least is going to be at the bottom. So yes, they might have some sprinkling in of things. I think of like breakfast cereals. All the vitamins and minerals are listed at the bottom of that because it's powder that's sprinkled into breakfast cereals, but or sprayed onto breakfast cereals. But uh, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how it's put in there and what it weighs. But I think it's kind of that, if you're seeing more sugary ingredients, salty ingredients, those tropical oils, um, or again, just the overall ingredient list is really long. So if you're seeing some of those things near the top, or that list is just especially long, you're kind of, why did it, I could probably make this at home and just use all the real food ingredients.
I like that. It's
Yeah.
sort of a good approach. Look first, is it in a box or a plastic container? Second, kind of look at the calories and nutrition facts, and then kind of work your way through the ingredients. I like
Yeah.
that approach. I think it's relatively intuitive for a lot of people on why these processed foods are maybe not the healthiest for us. But could you outline what are some of the maybe the more obvious detrimental impacts of processed foods, and then walk us through some of the less obvious consequences of eating them?
First and foremost, I think if we're thinking about added sugars, added fats, the concern there is added calories that may not be adding to our nutrition. They're there probably for texture, for shelf stability, not necessarily providing nutrients to us, and really probably upping that calorie count. So I think, first and foremost, I think it's just looking at how it impacts our weight, because we know just weight as a baseline can lead to other chronic diseases. So, I think it's that overall umbrella of, the foods we eat, we want them to be more nourishing and have those nourishing type ingredients, rather than things that are going to quickly just tally up calories. And then we have salt. And I think when we think of salt, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, maybe it's not good for my blood pressure. And yes, that's true, but I think, just even thinking the broader sense, if when you think about your blood pressure affects so many things. We might immediately think, "Oh, stroke risk." But, blood pressure impacts all of our organs. And so, just thinking about your whole system. Um, and so I think, we can kind of look at that from, just kind of, I want my body to be healthy. But I think we can also get into just like the idea of like how I feel when I eat some of these things. I think if you're having more sugar and more fat and not a lot of fiber, you might put that into your digestive system and just really not feel good. Um, so, kind of the long term and the short term, but kind of how they interplay is, again, you're probably not doing your digestive system any favors by putting things in it that um, don't move real well, because, then we can say, okay, now we'll go back to the long term. What is that doing to my bacteria that live in my gut? It's probably having an impact on them too, and we're learning more and more about the role of our gut bacteria. Some people call it the gut microbiome, and what it and its role in our overall health. And it really, it's kind of pointing toward, um, yeah, it probably impacts inflammation and how your food's absorbed and how different systems in your body work. And so it is worth paying attention to.
And I think those are great. I like how you kind of laid that out with some of the acute changes, with weight, energy, mood, and how you feel, and then some of the chronic things that can happen. And another thing I think I would add too is it sort of changes our palate and our desire as
Mhm.
well. And so you sort of get used to that and you want to recreate it and you do it again. And so it also can sort of lead you down this trail or this slippery slope. And many of us are a long way down that already and need to come back, which can make it hard. So I think that's another important factor to consider. Earlier you mentioned that processing food has its origins in food safety. What are some of the reasons that they are still so commonplace now? I think it probably goes a little beyond food safety, which you alluded to. So why is this so common, and why is it such an issue for us?
First and foremost, I think if it's taste. And I think if you ask a lot of people, why do I eat that particular food? They're going to say because it tastes good. Another very common answer we get is it's convenient. I can walk to the vending machine and grab it. I You can just open the bag and it's there. There's no preparation involved. And so taste and convenience are major drivers in the food that we eat. Those are probably the biggest reasons. But then beyond that, I think there is this idea of if I like the taste and it kind of and the moment kind of is like, wow, that's great. We kind of want to hang on to that. But I think after 2 or 3 bites, we realize that's gone. We're kind of back into our TV show or we're back into whatever we were doing, distracted eating. So it's this idea of we will tend to go back to something we think is going to make us happy. And I think that's in itself maybe another topic or issue, but it's just the idea of kind of how we balance these things in the end is really important. Yeah.
Well, it's a great point, and it's hard to argue that point. I don't think you can tell people that they're incorrect in that, right? And that, yeah, a lot of these foods do taste really good, and
Yeah.
these foods are more convenient. So, how do you start to counsel people to think beyond those two variables, knowing that those two variables are critically important for us? And I guess as a part of convenience, also they're more oftentimes more affordable, so you sort of have this, yeah, it tastes good. Yeah, it's more convenient. And yes, it's more affordable. Um, those are very legitimate arguments as to why people do eat processed food. How do you help folks get beyond those very legitimate reasons for doing it?
Yeah. And so I think it is kind of stepping back and saying, well, do you recognize that how you're eating is impacting how you feel? Your digestive health, how you're sleeping, just your overall energy level. And generally, if you're not feeling good and you can then to start looking at the reasons why, it might be what we're eating and drinking. So the idea of, okay, so if we want to change what we're eating and drinking, recognizing that it's 2025 and we're all busy people, that we're not necessarily not going to use processed foods. It's maybe what processed foods and how we do it. And so it might be that we choose foods that maybe are less processed, and then we add or complement them with foods that are much more nutritious.
Mhm.
Thinking, I'll give you an example. So it might be that there's a lot of families and that have pizza. It's the most popular food in America. So if your family says, I want pizza. Okay, well, how are we going to do pizza? You could make a homemade pizza. You might order a pizza in, you might get a frozen pizza. Again, probably different variations of how much processing is going on there in that food. But let's just say pizza, you get it. It's really how much pizza are we eating and what's complementing it. So if we can cut back our pizza by 1 or 2 slices, but add a bag of salad, open up a bag of salad, open up a can of pineapple, slice up an apple, open up a bag of baby carrots, add that to the meal. What we've done essentially is by decreasing the amount of pizza, we've decreased the amount of salt, we've decreased the amount of saturated fat, and any other things that might be in there that may not be beneficial to our health. And calories, we've cut back on the calories. So again, just that overall taking care of my body.
Using those things to get people to connect to their larger goal. Like I think, yes, saving time is a goal, saving money is a goal, being convenient is a goal, eating things that taste good is a goal. But overall, if you ask most people, they would say, you know what, I'm not as healthy as I want to be. I don't have the level of energy as I want. I don't feel as good. My body hurts. Like we have all these other things. And I think getting people to see that, yeah, a lot of those things are influenced by the food you eat. So, yes, you may have those smaller goals of the, time, convenience, taste, and affordable, but is it meeting your larger goals of being healthy and being the most successful person you could be and feeling good and having the energy and not being aching and in pain all the time? I think applying to some of those could be helpful, and then sort of taking that stepwise approach, like you meant. Maybe you don't have to eliminate pizza altogether, but start small and add in
Yeah.
something healthy.
Yeah. And at Dr. Camp, if I could just add something, the idea of affordability, when we think of that, nowadays, I think if someone went to buy a bag of, you know, snack chips or, something, what we would put into that ultra processed snack foods. We went to buy that. It's probably going to cost us $3 or $4 to buy that bag of snack food. Equally, it would probably cost us about $3 to buy a bag of apples or oranges if they're in season. And so we think about that from you know, an affordability. We're spending the same amount of money, but really when you look at the quantity of food, the quality of food, and then even just price, you know, kind of price per unit weight. That bag of apples or oranges is really heavy and compared to that, bag of snack food. And so it's that in itself, there's so many things that we could probably say, yeah, spending our money on the bag of apples or the bag of oranges has so many benefits.
Mm. I think too. I love that you talk about the weight difference between those two, and then if you look at the nutritional difference, if you think about
Mhm.
you know, how much vitamins, mineral, fiber, protein, like the good things you're getting per dollar spent, it becomes very clear what the better option is, and you're not going to get that in a bag of potato chips
Yeah.
like you would something healthy. You know,
Mhm.
one of the things I've always wondered is, does processed food affect us differently based on our age? And
Mhm.
mainly thinking about how to handle these conversations for people with kids. And we think, oh, they're a kid, they can eat anything, they'll feel fine, they'll
Yeah.
bounce, but it doesn't matter. You can give them whatever. Whereas with adults, we eat it. Oftentimes we feel it a little bit more. So all of these things we've talked about so far, are they equally important in children, or is it different?
I would agree. I think they're equally as important in children, and someone might even argue more so because they're still developing, right? Their whole system and everything is still developing. So their nutrient needs, or you could argue, are that much more important. I think the idea of where we are kind of fooled into thinking they're getting away with it is the fact that they are growing, and so their caloric needs are so high compared to us as adults. So they're growing, and that in itself is such a demand on their bodies. And hopefully they're outside playing or they're moving and they're doing. And again, they just have that activity level. Um, so yeah, I think we think, oh yeah, they're getting away with it. Like they're not having any health issues related to their intake of processed foods. But it's probably more about again, just if we could look inside and knowing that as adults, we can relate to, if I eat better, I feel better. The same for kids. They're probably going to have, their how they perform in school, how they do in their sports and activities, how they sleep. All of those things are going to be impacted just like they are for us. So,
And I think too, if you also just take a step back and look at how we're doing as a society, for the adults, you would say we're gaining weight, we're stressed, we're out of energy. We're not as healthy. We're going in a bad direction. If you look at the children, same thing's happening. So it would be one thing if we said none of our children were obese, they're all super active, they're not having any learning but there are some issues there that I think need to be sorted out too. So I do think we owe it to our children to treat them the same way and in the same manner. And I also think too, it's important to start these habits early. It's going to be so much easier for them if they learn this, from a young age, as opposed if they've been doing it the wrong way for 40 years and then they have to unlearn, 40 years of challenging behavior.
Yeah, and I think, you know, along that point as well is just, I think it is normal for us to celebrate with food. That's just part of our society, many societies. Food is a part of our celebrations and very much a fabric in within our lives. So we're not going to take that out, but I think it's sometimes it can be our only celebration or our only reward or our entertainment. And there's so many other things that we can reward or ways of rewarding, ways of entertaining, ways of spending time together that can be very meaningful other than saying, you know, let's eat whatever it is.
Yeah,
Mhm.
very good.
Yeah.
Well, I want to wade into some controversial waters here, if I can, for a minute. So, I think overall we can say we probably have too much processed food in our society or our culture. We'd be better without it. My next question is, whose fault is it? And I have some thoughts on this, but I would love to hear your thoughts because is this a consumer problem? That's the fault of the individual consumers, or is this the big food companies that are out there designing this stuff to get us addicted and trying to make us unhealthy? I'll give my thoughts, but I'm curious to hear your take on that first.
Okay. I'm going to walk a bit of a tightrope. Um, and so when I'm talking to people about, how do we eat better? One of my common statements is, you know, grocery stores and food manufacturers know we're busy. They know our time is in a crunch. So they know we're looking for convenience. And again, as human beings, we eat for taste and we eat for convenience. So that matchup is one that's to say, okay, we're kind of in a setup where we're as consumers, we're looking for what's quick and tastes good, and who's delivering it may or may not be interested in, you know, ultimately nutrition. Maybe they are, so I can't make that assumption because I think food companies put out very good food and others, maybe that's not their whole line. But I think that it's probably the system, you know,
Mhm.
from consumer to food manufacturer. There's probably needs to be a change in our system, but quite frankly, if we don't buy it, they're probably not going to make it.
Mm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
There is this notion or a school of thought out there that people think, oh, these grocery store CEOs or company CEOs are diabolical and they're trying to get us addicted and they're trying to make us unhealthy. And I don't know. For me personally, I don't necessarily see it that way. I see that these are folks that are running businesses and companies who want to be successful, just like any other company or business that wants to be successful. And I don't see any harm in that. I do agree with you that I think that there are certain grocery store chains, certain restaurants, certain food companies that do place a high emphasis on nutrition as opposed to others, and we kind of have an idea of who those are. But ultimately, I think that they're just trying to be successful, and they know the things that sell, and they know what we want and what we're asking for and what we buy, and so they're giving us the products that we're going to pay for, and I think that they have, as they have always done, will respond to demand and respond to markets. And all of a sudden, if we woke up tomorrow and everybody hated sugar, and they hated added sugar and they loved apples, and nobody was buying added sugar and everybody started buying apples, we would see things change. We would see grocery stores would change, food companies would change, restaurants would change. So I agree with you. It's a little bit of both, but in the end, I don't know that it really matters, other than I would say to individuals, if you have this thought of this is not my fault, I don't have any agency in this because these companies have designed this system that I can't possibly overcome. I think that can be an unhealthy approach to it because then there's a lot of hopelessness in that. And I do think that yes, it is challenging. Yes, society has been designed in such a way that does make it harder than it should be, but I still think there is hope, and I still think we have agency, and we should still say, "Yep, this is difficult. This is a hard problem, but I still have the ability to make some forward progress if I take the right steps."
Mhm. Yes, I completely agree. And I think, as we talk today, I think, we can definitely give people some ideas about
Let's do it.
how
Let's
to
do it.
make that progress. Yeah.
All right, so let's do it. Let's transition sort of into our third section here where we're going to talk about the steps people should take. And my first question actually is before we talk about the actual steps is one I hear commonly is how can I tell if I have too much processed food in my diet? And I hear that a lot. And for me, when I hear people ask that, it's that question in and of itself is almost an oversimplification of the problem, in my opinion. And I don't think it's this thing where it's either yes, you have too much or no, you do not, like a yes, no dichotomous thing. I think we all sort of exist along a spectrum.
Mhm.
On one end, there's the if you ate nothing but ultra processed food with a lot of salt and sugar and no nutritional value, that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end, there's the folks that are only eating 100% non processed whole foods. And I know a few of those, but there's not many of those. And so, 99.9% of us live somewhere between those two ends of the spectrum. And I almost view it as we shouldn't be saying I'm eating too much or I'm fine, like a yes no thing. We should say, all right, how can I continue to make forward progress and move in a direction that helps me accomplish the goals that I want in terms of being healthy, having, high levels of energy and achieving what I want to as a human being. That's sort of how I have always looked at this issue. Does that seem reasonable to you, or how do you approach that?
I absolutely think it's reasonable, and quite frankly, I think it's realistic. And I think that's what really in when we're trying to assess where we're at and changes we want for ourselves to improve our health and just how we feel, because that's really what it comes down to is I just want to feel better. And if that's the case, that's your first inventory, right? Is how I feel. And if you're saying I want to feel better or I want to feel different, then take inventory of what you're eating. Get a sense of, what am I really eating? Do I have any fruits and vegetables in my diet? And if so, how many? And, what are my meals? What do they look like? And do they have whole and wholesome foods, or are they on the other end of the spectrum? And and I think that's just it. So if they're on, the more processed end of the spectrum, just look at that food and say, how could I change that? And it might be that we don't absolutely say we're never going to eat it again. It's just maybe how do I change how that impacts me? Do I eat less frequently? Do I have a smaller portion of it? Um, or do I take that food and add other things to it, or complement things next to it that again move my health to a spectrum, how I feel to a spectrum of, along that spectrum it's better for me. And because it's perspective.
So if people are going to get started, they take inventory and say, okay, I'm doing not so good, or I'm okay. Regardless, I want to get better. What
Yeah.
are like the key areas you would suggest they start to target in terms of what foods to look for and what foods to try to reduce in their diet?
Yeah. I think what they're snacking on. And I don't wanna say easy, it's never easy, but, that might be a place to start. What do you like during the day? And for a lot of people struggle in the evening. What's happening in the evening time after dinner, when we're especially tired, and our decision making is more challenged, look at, is there a time of the day that I'm struggling, and is there a particular food that I'm struggling with? That might be your inventory questions. And then to say, okay, is it a particular food? Is it a particular time? What can I do differently with that food or at that time? For a time thing, it might be, well, it's 9 o'clock and maybe I shouldn't walk back into the kitchen. Maybe I should start my bedtime routine. Whereas, if it's a food thing, it might be again frequency, amount, and then to say, really, could I add something wholesome? Could I add a fruit? Could I add a vegetable? Could I add, some, a protein-rich food like a slice of cheese or a cheese stick or, a yogurt or, something like that? Could I add some type of food like that in that is going to give me more nutrition? And feel more sustainable, because I think that's part of this too, is like if we are snacking on things that don't necessarily have a lot of nutrition, they don't have the fiber, the protein, the vitamins, the minerals, we don't ever feel kind of fully restored. And so if we start adding in those foods with more nutrients in them, our body is going to just feel more satisfied. It's going to get the things it needs.
And just to kind of to help folks sort of sort through, what are some of the most common processed foods that you see people eating that you would suggest they get out? So the most common ultra processed foods maybe that people use as snacks that they should target. What are some
Yeah.
examples?
Probably the variety of like fried snack foods, you know, and those can come in variety of shapes and forms and colors, right? Um, so it's hard to say like a potato chip, but it could be any fried corn based or potato based or whatever it is based product that's shaped a certain way and fried, and then it's seasoned with a lot of different things. I'll say that would be, or dessert, like dessert foods or, um,
Candy type
it
things.
yeah, candy type things, packaged desserts, again, that come in a variety of shapes and colors and are going to have a lot of things, added to them for texture and flavor and those types of things. Um, Because again, we're probably looking for something crunchy, something sweet, something to give us energy, and we can get that from wholesome foods. We can get a crunchy vegetable, we can get a crunchy nut, we can get a sweet piece of fruit. We can if that's what we're looking for, we can replace those taste and texture things. Um, or we can complement those taste and texture things. So again, maybe it's a smaller amount of that food that's ultra processed, and you ease the process by adding something else. So it's like because our stomach and our eyes and kind of the again system of how, if I just serve someone up a smaller portion, they're going to look at it and be like, well, that's a smaller portion, that does not make me happy.
I'm
So
onto your games, Kate. Yeah, yeah, I'm not buying this. Yeah.
so oftentimes if you put more food in front of somebody, again,
Mhm.
this is our way. So if I present you with your, typical snack in a smaller portion, but then I put some sliced apples or some sliced strawberries or, something along or something else alongside of it, you're gonna be like, oh, colorful, volume, looks good, sweet, like those things. The acceptance of the process of the change is probably gonna be better.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things too is it's helpful to not keep these foods in your house if you don't want to eat them, not purchase them at the grocery store.
Mhm.
Those are some areas that we could all probably improve on to a certain degree. What about when you're dining out? And so,
Yeah.
you're with friends and you go out to eat. Any tips for folks navigating those situations?
Yeah. Ultimately, if you could eat out less, I think the more you put yourself in control of your food, better. But it is, like you said, there's a social component, and being social is part of our overall wellness. And so we'll go out to dinner with our friends and have a nice time. But then I think again, it's looking for wholesome foods. Can you get a lean piece of protein rich food, like if it's a lean piece of meat, or is it a rice and bean based dish, or can I find a vegetable? Can I get a vegetable soup? Can I get a salad? Can I get a side of broccoli? Maybe they have a fruit salad. I think it's perusing the menu and looking for some of those more wholesome foods. And I think, the idea of sauces and condiments and the things we add for flavor and texture, that's where we're gonna see some more of that ultra processing kind of creep into our meal.
Good. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that always helps me too is pre-deciding before you go out to eat.
Yeah.
Sometimes if
Yeah.
you're undecided and then you look at the menu, that's not when your discipline's at its highest level too. So
Mm,
oftentimes pre-deciding that you're going to, eat a certain thing before you go, that can be another helpful tip as well. So
yeah.
speaking as tips, as we start to come to the end here, I would love to hear kind of what are your top tips that you would give to somebody, maybe 4 or 5 tips, someone who's new to this or starting on their journey to eliminate processed foods that'll set them up for success.
Yeah. So if I could play off what you just said, having that plan before going to the restaurant and putting yourself in that immediate situation, you know, often if we have a plan, we don't necessarily have to rely on our willpower. And, we can grit our teeth and we can rely on that willpower for probably a certain amount of time. And then it, we, it may slip and we will slip and we're going to feel really bad about it. And we're going to think we failed and we're just going to go back to our old ways. I think having a plan that feels realistic and doable and knowing that we're not perfect human beings just allows us to kind of approach this like it's a process. And I think that's what is maybe helpful to think, a lot of us say, well, I'm never going to eat that again. I don't know that that works really for most people. It wouldn't work for me. Um, I think it's the idea of I need to be, again, realistic and practical and say, well, if I'm going to do it, I need a plan for it. So I'm going to say, you know what? On Friday night, I'm going to allow myself to have, if it's a dish of ice cream or go out for ice cream or have whatever that food is. And just make that allowance so that plan, um, so you have an approach that feels comfortable to you. And again, knowing that as we go through, if it's something that you're having with more frequency and you're making this change, that you might try it, it might not work. And again, you're going to think you failed. No, the system you tried didn't work. It's just like an experiment. You might have to take a different route and figure out, okay, maybe I just need to do this a different way. So again, be forgiving, allow yourself to be creative and think of other solutions. Just don't think I failed. Um, and then I think it's really looking at, what can I do? Think about simple ads. You know, don't overthink this. Like, oh, I have to spend an hour now. I have to chop everything and cook everything from scratch every night. Where am I going to find an hour and a half? You don't have to. I think it's the idea of it's considered processed, but take the frozen vegetables out of the freezer and put them in the microwave and add them to your dish. Or if you're, um, maybe you're getting something that is, has a little more processing. It might be like an example could be like they make rice mixes that have a seasoning packet. And again, there's processing that's going on there, and we might say, well, what's in that seasoning packet? But well, okay, let's just say that's what's going to happen for dinner. To that rice, you can add a can of beans. You can add a can of tomatoes. You can add a frozen bag of mixed vegetables. You can get this meal to your table in a half hour or less. Um, and yes, you used processed ingredients, but your approach was a whole lot less processed. And what you've essentially done is any of that salt or whatever those things were in that seasoning packet, you've diluted it. You've diluted the effect because you've added a potassium from your tomatoes. You've added protein and fiber and magnesium from your beans. You've added all this nutrition. So the overall impact and effect is completely different.
That's great. That's a fantastic list. I'm kind of writing, as we go here. So if I could summarize what you said so far,
Yeah.
have a plan, which I think
Mhm.
helps. Sort of pre-decide, but
Yeah.
also allow some flexibility for yourself, knowing that you may not nail it the first time, and just keep iterating and sort of anticipate that you're going to fail at some point, and don't beat yourself up, but keep going. I also like the concept you talked about thinking about adding nutritional value. So this is not just about taking away things; it's also about adding things in their place. And I think if you do that, it makes the exchange seem easier. So rather than giving something up, you're really just exchanging. And then I also like the thought of keeping it simple. You don't have to overthink this. Keep it easy, and it doesn't mean you have to go from eating a lot of highly processed foods to being purely whole food, non-processed. It is a process, and it's okay if there are some things that are minimally processed. Just try to reduce the amount of processed food that you're eating.
Yes. Yes, nice summary, Dr. Cam.
Great. Well, thank you. So, I've been taking notes as we go. I've learned a lot in chatting with you. So, I'm going to kind of recap some of the big take home points for me. First, we defined what processed food really is, and I like how you talked about the different categories of process, and we really should think about these things on a spectrum with ultra highly processed on one end and then kind of minimally processed on the others. And speaking of that spectrum, our goal is really to try to move more towards the minimally processed and away from the ultra processed. It's not just a clear either or, yes or no, everything's processed or nothing's processed. So sort of living along that spectrum. We also talked about how processing of food has its origins in food safety, which is still a big component of it, but now a lot of it is all about taste and convenience. And even though those things are good goals and valuable goals and they're appealing to us, they're not always consistent with our larger goals of feeling good, having energy, not being tired, growing appropriately for children, and really kind of being our best self. So I think sometimes when we're trying to make the decision on what to do, we need to think about our larger goals and how those often might supersede our smaller goals. And you also called me out on the part about processed foods being more affordable, and that you're exactly right in that certain unprocessed foods, if you do it well, don't necessarily have to be so expensive. So there are ways to do this on a budget, and I think no matter where we are in our journey, there are things in here that we can all approve on. So I'll give you a chance to summarize here. We started the session with the three big questions, so I'd like to ask those back to you to get your summary answer. So our first question: what exactly are processed foods, and why do they matter so much to our overall health?
Sure. So, processed foods are any food that has been altered, but it's really to the degree that it's been altered where we really see its impact on our health. Minimally processed foods, nuts out of the shell, great. But as we move along that spectrum and we move to removing more nutrients and adding additives, preservatives, things that are enhancing flavor, texture, shelf life, they're probably not in our best interest in terms of our health.
And why do so many of us rely on processed foods despite the known downsides?
Right? We're all busy. And so um, when we think about our time, the demands on our time, wanting to have tasty, convenient foods, um, and doing it within our family budget, really those it can be tempting to kind of fall into, some of what's offered at grocery stores or even, at drive-throughs or other restaurants. But I think it's coming back to the idea that there are minimally processed foods that are very nutritious and you can very quickly kind of assemble those things. You don't necessarily have to be a gourmet chef. You can be an assembler and put them together for a very nutritious meal. Might not look like fanciness, but it is still good and nutritious.
And then what are some practical steps we can take now to minimize processed foods in our diet?
First and foremost, what can I add? Can I add a fruit? Can I add a vegetable? Can I add a nutritious food that can offset the frequency or the amount of the ultra processed foods that I am having? That's a I think a great approach if that works for you. But I think that's just it. If that doesn't work for you, think of another way that might. Some people are just saying it's not coming into the house, and if that works for them, it works for them. But if you try that and it doesn't work, know that there are other ways. So it need not be all or nothing, and it need not be figured out tomorrow. be patient with yourself and give yourself some time.
Great. Well, we always like to wrap up with a sort of a challenge or a call to action for the audience to kind of help get them started in the process of getting better. And thinking, as we went through that third section, a couple ideas came to mind for me. The two things so you've got two options out there, optimizers after this session. So one would be for snacking at home. So both of these are going to play off the idea of having a plan and sort of pre-deciding. So pre-decide what your snack is going to be before that hunger or craving hits you. No, so have something available. And Kate listed a lot of great options. Have something available that you think, okay, next time I'm hungry, this is what I'm going to go to for my snack. And then the second challenge is next time you go out to eat, pre-decide as well. Before you even go to the restaurant, if you're somebody who struggles, when you get to the restaurant, before you go, look at the menu online. When it's less tempting, you can't see all the pictures and you don't have the smells around you and you're not seeing the food going to everybody else's table. Choose what you're going to eat. When you get to the restaurant, don't even look at the menu, just order it. Pre-decide. That takes the stress and makes it a lot easier. So those are a couple of different options that you can do for your challenge to kind of get you started in this process. So, well, there we have it. Kate Zeratsky just did a phenomenal job walking us through this difficult topic, unwrapping the truth about processed foods, impact on your health, and how to overcome the temptation. Something we all struggle with. I think we would all have room for improvement. So, Kate, thank you so much for offering up your wisdom and tips and tricks for how we can all get better in this area.
Well, thanks for having me, Dr. Camp. It was a pleasure.
Great. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. As always, remember to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be and never stop optimizing. Thank you for tuning in to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project. If you enjoyed this session, please subscribe and leave a review so others can find us. If you know anyone else that would benefit from this discussion, please share this episode to join us in our mission to help as many people as possible become the best humans they can be. That's all for today, but we want to hear from you. Email us at optimize@mayo.edu to let us know how you're progressing in your own human optimization journey and tell us what topics you want to hear about in the future. For more helpful tips and content, be sure to follow us on Instagram, X, and YouTube.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon for medical, professional, or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified professional for any questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions expressed by the guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.